The letter from her uncle had taken 3 weeks to reach Columbus, and by the time Nell Patton stepped off the stage in Sable Creek, Montana Territory, Robert Patton had been in the ground for 2 months. She learned this from the postmaster, a thin man named Mr. Howell, who broke the news the way people deliver bad weather, matter-of-factly, without apology, because there was no use in softening what could not be changed. Fever, he said, came on fast in July. The mercantile had been sold to cover the debts. There was nothing left. He handed her a short note that her uncle had written in his last days, clearly not expecting it to be the last thing he ever wrote to her. It was cheerful. It told her the room was waiting, that the stock was good this season, that she would like Montana once she got used to the cold. She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket. She sat on the steps of the post office because she did not know where else to sit. Her trunk was behind her, solid and heavy as a tombstone. She had $31 and a handful of coins sewn into the lining of her traveling bag, enough to get somewhere, if she could think of a somewhere to go. But she had sold her lease on the Columbus boarding house room before leaving. She had given notice at the accounting firm where she had kept books for the past 4 years. She had sold her winter coat, the good one, the wool one with the fur collar, because she would not need an Ohio winter coat in Montana. She had planned for everything except for this. The September air smelled of pine smoke and cold stone, and something vast that had no name in any city she had ever lived in. Around her, Sable Creek went about its business. A blacksmith's hammer rang out 2 streets over. A dog barked once and fell silent. A woman in a blue apron crossed the far end of the street without looking up. Nell pressed her hands together in her lap and stared at the dust between her boots. A sound escaped her before she could stop it. Not quite a word, barely a breath, barely even a sound at all. But it was the truest thing she had said in days. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." She said it to no one. She meant it for no one. It was simply a fact that had become too heavy to carry silently any longer. Across the street, leaning against the rail of the feed store, with a list of supplies in one hand, and no particular hurry about anything, Cass Defro heard her. He was not a man who collected other people's troubles. He had enough of his own. The north fence line that needed rebuilding before the first snow. The water rights dispute with his eastern neighbor that had been dragging through correspondence for 2 years. The ledgers in his office that had not been properly reconciled since Eleanor died. He was good at cattle and weather, and the 1,000 small decisions that kept a working ranch alive. He was not good at the ledgers. He had never been good at the ledgers. He watched the woman on the steps without meaning to. He had seen her off the stage. He had noticed the careful way she carried herself, the straight back, the deliberate movements of someone who had decided to project composure, whether she felt it or not. He had seen her go into the post office and come out again a few minutes later with that composure, slightly cracked like a plate that had been dropped and not yet broken. He was not a man to interfere in things that were not his business. But the sound she had made, that half word, that quiet admission, had a quality to it that he recognized. It was the sound of a person who had run out of options and hadn't yet found the courage to say so aloud. He pushed himself off the rail and walked inside the feed store. He settled his account with Mr. Pell, arranged for the supplies to be loaded onto his wagon. He stood for a moment in the cool shadow of the store, his hat in his hands, looking at nothing in particular. Then he walked outside, crossed the street, and stopped in front of her. Nell Patton looked up. She saw a man somewhere in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of sun-darkened face that came from years of outdoor work. His eyes were a quiet gray. He held his hat at his side, and he looked at her directly, without pity and without curiosity. Just the steady, assessing look of someone deciding whether to say a thing or not. He decided. "My name is Devereaux," he said. "Cass Devereaux. I run a cattle ranch about 8 miles north." He paused, as though choosing his next words the same way he might choose a tool, for function, not elegance. "I heard what you said. I wasn't trying to." The warmth that rose in her face was automatic. She started to say something dismissive. "I'm not offering charity," he said, before she could. "I'm offering a job. My bookkeeper left in the spring, and I haven't found a replacement. The accounts are 3 seasons behind, and I'm losing money I probably don't know I'm losing." He looked at her steadily. "If you have experience keeping books, the position pays $22 a month, plus room and board. The room is small but clean. The work is honest." Nell looked at him carefully. In her 4 years at the accounting firm, she had learned to read a ledger in under a minute, where the errors were, where the gaps were, where someone was trying to hide something. She read people the same way. She looked at this man and found no performance in him, no warmth being performed to put her at ease, no calculation being hidden behind a friendly face. Just a straightforward transaction, stated in plain language: take it or leave it. "I kept books for Alden Brothers Commercial in Columbus for 4 years, she said. "Before that, I kept my father's accounts from the time I was 16. "That's sufficient," he said. "I have a trunk. I have a wagon." She stood up, brushed the dust from her skirt, and picked up her traveling bag. She looked at the trunk, then at him, then made the only decision available to her that was not surrender. "All right, Mr. Devereaux," she said. "I'll take the position." He loaded her trunk without comment. She climbed up onto the wagon bench and settled herself. And they drove out of Sable Creek into the open country without another word. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was simply the silence of 2 people who had nothing yet to say to each other and saw no reason to fill the space with noise. The Devereaux Ranch sat at the edge of a long valley, where a creek came down from the mountains and flattened out across a wide meadow before disappearing into the trees. The main house was a substantial timber building, well built, clearly the work of someone who had intended permanence, but showing the particular kind of neglect that falls over a house when one person is keeping it up alone and has other things on their mind. The garden beside the porch had gone to weeds. One of the porch steps had a soft spot in it that gave slightly underfoot. Inside, the furniture was good and solid and dusty. Cass Devereaux showed her the house with the efficiency of a man running through a checklist. Kitchen, pantry, parlor, the office at the back of the house where the ledgers were kept. He opened the office door and gestured inside without speaking. Nell looked at the desk, at the stacks of paper, at the 2 ledger books lying open and clearly abandoned mid-entry. "I'll need a few days to understand the system," she said. "There isn't one," he said. "That's the problem." He showed her to her room last. It faced east, toward the mountains. There was a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a white pitcher, and a window that let in the particular clear light of September at elevation. It was austere and quiet, and nothing like any room she had ever lived in, and it was, without question, hers. "Thank you, Mr. Devereaux," she said. He nodded once and left her to it. She did not rest. She changed out of her traveling dress, tied on an apron she found hanging behind the kitchen door, and walked through the house room by room, taking stock. The kitchen was the worst of it. Not dirty, exactly, but deeply disordered. The way a kitchen gets when whoever is using it is doing so with no particular interest in cooking and every intention of simply getting through another meal. Tins were stacked without sense. The flour was nearly out. There were potatoes in the cellar, and a smoked ham hanging in the larder, and that, combined with the herbs she found in a crockery jar above the stove, was enough. By the time Cass Devereaux came in from the barn with his 2 ranch hands, a compact, weathered man named Duff and a younger one called Remy, who looked barely old enough to shave, supper was on the table. Roasted ham and pan gravy, potatoes with rosemary, biscuits that had come out of the iron oven, the color of pale gold. The 3 men sat down and looked at the table for a moment, in the way men look at something they weren't expecting and don't quite know how to account for. "Miss Patton," Duff said finally, with a gravity that struck her as almost ceremonial, "that smells like a real supper." "It is a real supper," she said. "Eat it while it's hot." They did. They ate with a focused, grateful silence, and when they were done, Remy said, "Thank you, ma'am," so sincerely that it was clear it had been a long time since anyone had made him feel like the meal mattered. Cass said nothing, but he ate every bite, and he refilled his coffee twice, and Nell noticed. She spent the following 3 days in the office. The ledgers were exactly as bad as they appeared, not fraudulent, just neglected. Cass Devereaux understood cattle prices and weather and terrain. He did not understand double-entry bookkeeping, and the clerk who had done it before had used a system that was idiosyncratic to the point of being nearly private. Nell unpacked it methodically, ruling fresh lines on new paper, transferring entries, hunting down receipts from the pile on the desk, and cross-referencing them against what had been recorded. On the 3rd day, she found the lumber account. She sat back in the chair and looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she went through the previous season's invoices and the season before that. She pulled out the freight manifests and ran the numbers 3 times to be certain. That evening, she knocked on the frame of the office door. Cass was at the desk, going through correspondence that had accumulated over the summer. "The Caldwell Lumber Company," she said, setting the paper in front of him. "They've been charging you a freight premium on every order for at least 3 years. They're billing for a mountain route surcharge that doesn't apply to your location. You're well within the Valley delivery zone. The difference is $43 per order. You place 4 orders a year." Cass looked at the paper. He looked at it for a long time. "That's $170 a year," he said. $172. And there's a supplier in Garrison who runs Valley delivery at a flat rate. If we switch, we save the overcharge, and the Garrison rate is $6 cheaper per order besides." He was quiet for a moment. "How did Caldwell get away with it for 3 years?" "Because no one looked," she said simply. He looked up at her then, with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Not surprise, exactly. Something more careful than surprise. "Write the letter to Garrison," he said. She did. The new contract started the following month, and the savings were exactly what she had calculated. Something shifted between them after that, though neither of them acknowledged it in words. There were no words between them about most things. Cass Devereaux expressed himself through action, though, the way other men expressed themselves through speech, and Nell was beginning to understand this. The way you understand a language you have not studied, but have been surrounded by long enough to start hearing. The soft spot on the porch step was repaired one morning while she was in the kitchen baking bread. She came out and found it solid underfoot and fresh sanded, and there was no one in sight to thank. A better oil lamp appeared on her office desk, brighter, with a cleaner chimney, replacing the dim one she had been squinting past all week. The weeds in the kitchen garden were cleared one Saturday, and someone had planted 3 new rows of what would be garlic in the spring. None of these things were mentioned. They were simply done. She responded in kind. There was always coffee on the stove when he came in at first light, strong enough to stand a spoon in, the way she had noticed he preferred it. His work shirts were mended with careful stitches in the evenings. When she learned from Duff, in passing, that Cass had once been particularly fond of gingerbread. Before he stopped bothering with it, there was gingerbread on the kitchen table on a Sunday. He sat down at the table and looked at it the way he had looked at the supper that first night, with that careful, accountant expression, as though trying to determine what the thing cost. "Duff talks too much," he said. "Duff talks exactly the right amount," she said, and went back to her mending. Duff and Remy had long since taken to finding reasons to be elsewhere in the evenings, which Nell suspected was no accident. She noticed the way they exchanged glances when Cass held the kitchen door for her. She noticed the careful way they arranged themselves at the supper table so that she and Cass always ended up seated across from each other. Mr. Callister, who ran the neighboring spread and who was constitutionally incapable of keeping his observations to himself, came by in October to discuss a stray bull and ended up sitting at Nell's kitchen table, drinking the best coffee he'd had in years. "You know what your problem is, Devereaux," Callister said, setting his cup down with the confident authority of a man who considered himself helpful. He jerked his chin in Nell's direction, though she had just stepped out of the room. "Your problem is, you're too slow. Woman like that doesn't wait around forever for a man to figure out what's in front of him." Cass looked at his own cup. "I appreciate your thoughts, Mr. Callister," he said, in a voice that indicated he did not. But after Callister left, Cass stood at the window for a long time, watching the light change on the mountains, and the thought he was trying not to think would not be turned away. The ranch had been a working place since Eleanor died. Just a working place. Something to keep him occupied while the years moved past. He had not thought about it as a home in a long time. Now he found himself thinking about it that way, and realizing that the change had happened gradually, so gradually he hadn't noticed the exact moment of it, only the difference between before and after. He was thinking about this 3 days later, when a buggy came up the drive from the main road. The man who stepped out was dressed in a way that announced itself. Good wool coat, polished boots, the kind of carefully arranged pleasantness that Nell had seen on certain lawyers and certain salesmen and had learned not to trust on sight. "Good afternoon," the man said, looking toward Cass, who had come out of the barn. "I'm looking for the owner of this property. My name is Braddock, Franklin Braddock. I represent the Western Expansion Land Trust out of Chicago." Nell had just come through the front door with a basket of apples from the cellar. At the name, she stopped walking. The basket stayed in her hands, but her hands forgot to hold it properly, and 2 apples rolled off the top and bumped down the porch steps one at a time into the dust. Braddock, the Western Expansion Land Trust. 3 months ago in Columbus, it had been the Braddock Freight and Mercantile Trust. Before that, in 1874, in Dayton, it had been the Braddock Railway Development Company. She knew these names because she had spent 2 months in the summer of 1876 going through every document she could find, trying to understand how her father's mill had gone from solvent to bankrupt in the space of 4 months, and whose name appeared on the original investment contract that had triggered the collapse. She picked up the apples from the dust. She went back inside. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the low murmur of voices from the porch. That evening, Cass spread the papers on the desk. The offer was for the eastern parcel, rocky ground, mostly useless for grazing, good for nothing the ranch presently needed. The price offered was generous. The document was long and dense, the kind of legal language that was designed to look like precision, but was actually designed to obscure. She picked it up and read it slowly. She had read documents like this before. She had read the one that had destroyed her father's business, and she had read it 4 years after the fact, understanding finally what she had not understood when she was 22. And her father was showing her the figures and telling her it would be all right. She set the papers down and put her hand flat over the top of them. "I know this man," she said. Her voice was steady. She had decided, on the walk from the kitchen to the office, that she would say this, the way she said everything that mattered, without drama, without apology, as a simple fact, not personally, but his company, or what it's been called before. In Ohio, 3 years ago, he ran a scheme called the Braddock Freight and Mercantile Trust. He went into small towns and offered contracts to business owners, generous terms, land deals, investment arrangements. When he had enough signed agreements, he declared insolvency and took the assets. She looked at Cass directly. "My father's mill was one of the businesses he destroyed. My father spent 2 years trying to recover and he didn't. He died in the winter of 1877, and the doctors said it was his lungs, but I know what it really was." She paused. "He ran the same scheme in Dayton before that, and probably other places I don't know about. This document has the same structure, the infrastructure fee clause in Section 4, the renegotiation window in Section 9 that gives his company the right to alter terms after 60 days. These are the escape hatches." Cass had not moved while she spoke. He looked at the papers. He looked at the numbers, which were real and substantial. He looked at Nell. She had worked for him for 6 weeks. In 6 weeks she had rebuilt his accounts from 3 seasons of disorder, saved him money he hadn't known he was losing, organized his pantry, mended his shirts, and never once said anything that she could not account for. He thought about the ledgers. He thought about Garrison lumber. He thought about the gingerbread on a Sunday morning. He thought about the word trust and what it actually meant to extend it. He picked up the contract. He folded it once, deliberately, along the middle crease. Then he tore it in half and dropped it in the wastepaper basket. "All right," he said. Nell exhaled slowly. The next morning, Franklin Braddock arrived expecting to finalize the sale. Cass met him at the gatepost, arms crossed, expression final. "We won't be proceeding," Cass said. "The Devereaux Ranch isn't interested." Braddock's smile held for a moment through sheer professional practice. "I think you may be making a hasty decision, Mr. Devereaux. The offer stands as written. If you'd like more time to review—" "We've reviewed it," Cass said. Braddock looked past him then, toward the porch, where Nell was standing in the shadow of the doorframe. Something moved across his face. Recognition, followed by calculation, followed by the decision that there was nothing here worth fighting for. He was a man who understood when a scheme had been seen clearly. He gave a short nod, turned back to his buggy, and left without another word. The sound of the wheels on the gravel carried a long way in the morning quiet. That evening was cold, the first real cold of the season, and Cass had built up the fire in the main room. Nell was at the table with the mending, and he was in the chair across from her with a letter he was supposed to be writing, though he had written 3 sentences in an hour. He set the letter aside. "Your father," he said. It was not a question, and it was not quite a statement. It was the opening of something he didn't have the words for yet. "He was a good man," she said, A careful man. He trusted people who were skilled at appearing trustworthy. Cass was quiet for a while. The fire shifted and settled. I was the same, he said, with the lumber contract. 3 years and I just paid the bill. You had other things to think about. So did you, he looked at her. You still learn to read the contracts. She looked up from the mending. There was something in his expression that was different from his usual careful neutrality. More open and more uncertain, in the way of a man who has arrived at a thing he intended to say and now must actually say it. I want to ask you something, he said. I'm going to ask it plainly, because I don't know any other way to ask it. All right, she said. He put the unwritten letter on the table. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. I had a wife, he said. She died 3 years ago, and the honest truth is that after she died, I stopped thinking of this place as anything more than a job that needed doing. I worked it because it was mine, and because I didn't know what else to do with myself. He paused. That's not how I think about it now, and I've been trying to be fair-minded about why. And I can't make the reason come out to anything other than you. Nell set down the mending. You've been here 6 weeks, he said. I know that isn't long. I'm not a man who moves fast on things, in general, so the fact that I'm saying this in 6 weeks should tell you something about how seriously I mean it. He took a slow breath. I would like to ask if you'd consider staying, not as the bookkeeper, as my wife. I understand if the answer is no, and it won't change your position here if it is, because that's not the kind of man I am. But I needed to say it plainly, and I needed you to know I mean it the same way. The fire made its quiet sound. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, soft and unhurried, against the dark. Nell Patton had been careful for a long time. She had been careful because her father was gone, and there was no one to catch her if she fell. And being careful was the only thing that stood between her and the kind of situation she'd found herself in 2 months ago, on the steps of a post office in Sable Creek with $31 and nowhere to go. She had been careful because careful was how you survived. But she was looking at this man with his steady gray eyes and his plain words, and the wastepaper basket full of torn contract. And she understood something that she had been circling for weeks without letting herself land on it. I came here with nothing, she said. I want you to understand that, not as a warning, just as a fact. I don't have family money or property or any of the things a woman is supposed to bring to a marriage. I know that, he said. I'm not asking for any of that. What are you asking for? You, he said. It was the simplest sentence she had ever heard him say. Just you, whatever that amounts to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ask me properly, Cass. He almost smiled. She had never seen him almost smile before. But it was there, a small, careful thing at the corner of his mouth. He got up from his chair, which she had not expected, and went to one knee in front of her, with the gravity of a man who believed in doing things the right way. Miss Patton, he said, Nell, will you marry me? Yes, she said, I will. They were married on a Saturday in November, in the main room of the ranch house, with the circuit minister and Duff and Remy as witnesses and Mr. Callister, who had not been invited but had heard about it somehow, and arrived anyway, with his hat in his hands and a jug of something he insisted was for the occasion. Nell wore her blue dress and a sprig of dried columbine that Cass had kept, she later learned, from the last flowers of the summer. He had not told her he was keeping it. He had simply kept it, the way he did most things, quietly, without announcement. 4 years later, Nell stood at the office window, on a morning in early October, watching the light come across the valley. The ledgers on the desk behind her were current to the day. The lumber contract with the Garrison supplier had been renegotiated twice since she'd first written to them, and the terms improved each time. The water rights dispute with the eastern neighbor had been settled. Nell had read through the correspondence and found the flaw in the opposing argument and written the letter that resolved it in a single exchange. The ranch had done well. Cass was talking to a man in Billings about expanding the herd, and Nell had run the numbers 3 times and told him it was sound, and he had trusted her numbers the way he always trusted her numbers, which was to say completely and without ceremony. She heard him come in through the back, heard him stop in the kitchen for the coffee that was waiting for him, heard his boots on the floorboards as he came down the hall. He stopped in the office doorway. He looked at her at the window, the morning light on her face, and she saw in him what she had learned to recognize in 4 years of watching him, the particular quality of his stillness when he was looking at something he was grateful for and did not know how to say so. She saved him the trouble. "Coffee's strong," she said. "It always is," he said. He came to stand beside her at the window. He put his arm around her shoulders, warm and solid, and they stood together and looked out at the valley and the mountains and the long, clear sky of a Montana morning. She had not come here looking for this. She had come here looking for a room in her uncle's house and a job at a mercantile and a way to survive the winter. She had arrived with a broken plan and $31 and a trunk full of everything she owned. What she had found was not what she had planned for. It was something better than a plan. It was a life, built from honest work and plain words, and the kind of trust that is not given quickly, but once given, does not diminish. It had never been a rescue. She had known that from the first day. It had been an offer of work, and she had worked, and somewhere in the work, without either of them making a declaration about it, they had built a home.